South African aviation routes used to be one of the best aircrafts on the planet. Then they weren't, and afterward, they weren't so much as one of the best on the African landmass anyway. After years in an in-between state, it looks like they are back and attempting to recover their magnificent days. So what happened to history? South African aviation routes established in 1934. South African Aviation Routes was one of the first state-possessed carriers on the planet. They were first framed as the Sioux Africans Luke Senior members after the obtaining of the now outdated association, Airways, by the South African government, as South Africa were under a politically sanctioned racial segregation system at the time. They normally wound up having to sidestep the whole African mainland with their airplanes because of approvals. However, over the course of the following couple of many years, South African aviation routes would develop gradually, however consistently, as they would present some significant highlights. For example, intercontinental administration and freight transport. These highlights, combined with the way that most of their travelers were upper center class people, implied that South African aviation routes was one of the most beneficial state-possessed carriers in the world. By the mid to late 70s, they started to fly Asian courses like Hong Kong. What's more, Taipei, with the South African government being a rarity nations on the planet, at the opportunity to perceive Taiwan as a sovereign country after a section stowaway was finished in 1990, defeats with Africa opened up for South African aviation routes. This implied they could fly more defeats than any time in recent memory, and had to grow, adding the first of their 8 Boeing 747s to their armada. In 1991, the speed of development eased back throughout the following not many years, yet a rebranding exertion in 1996 carried new life to the carrier, and they saw their fairly estimated worth ascent by nearly 500%. They consistently expanded their armada throughout the following couple of years, and, surprisingly, concurred an arrangement to buy a 49% stake in a Tanzania. Albeit the consolidation would fizzle after the SAA, the executives considered it unrewarding. This time of development would not go on perpetually. However, as in 2009, charges of degenerate corruption and nepotism gradually started to crawl into the carrier's activities. This guaranteed that a portion of the carrier's reserves were horribly botched and were essentially arranging the pockets of a couple of men. This sort of conduct, added to declining traveler numbers, implied that South African aviation routes started to confront a large group of monetary hardships in the early 2000s and 10s, and by 2019, the South African government reported that SLDOA would go into liquidation insurance due to not recording misfortunes for 8 back-to-back of years. The COVID-19 pandemic would be the last nail in the final resting place for South African aviation routes, as most aircrafts all over the planet required bailouts to endure the A's of now battling SAE, couldn't get the size of bailout it expected to get by. Due to this mishap, the South African government declared that they would quit subsidizing the carrier. And on the 2nd of May 2020, South African aviation routes stopped activities following 86 years in assistance. However, for reasons unknown, this was not the end for South African aviation routes. So what occurred? The rebound. While the South African government didn't thoroughly stop activities for the SAA, the plan was to make another transporter from what could be rescued of the underlying SAA. Anyway, they required something like 10 billion rands, or around $550 million, to continue activities, and suspended all flight tasks until subsidizing could be obtained. Fortunately for SREA, the South African government would step in once again, as confidential financial backers couldn't be figured out. This opportunity rescuing them to the tune of 10.5 billion rands, which was somewhat higher than first arranged all through the extended period of 2020. South African aviation routes would return 34 of its Airbus Armada to their lessors, yet confidential examiners started to show interest, and by June 2021, the South African government would surrender its controlling stake in the carrier, giving more than 51% to an affiliation, which they'd chosen. The arrangement was finished in mid-2022, and by October of that year, they were previously going through development processes, adding 2 Airbus A322-200 airplanes to their armadas, as well as adding new courses from Johannesburg to major air terminals in neighboring nations like Namibia. They were flying all the more often anyway, just across the South African area. However, not for long in light of the fact that in 2023, long-stretch flights would be once again introduced by South African aviation routes following 3 years without the choice. Intercontinental departures from Cape Town turned into a plausibility once more, and there's presently a choice to fly from Cape Town to Sao Paulo in Brazil. This is astounding information for South African aviation routes in light of the fact that, as additional courses keep on opening, South African aviation routes would have to extend its ongoing armada, as what it right now has would presumably not have the option to cut it into the huge associations it seems to be. South African aviation routes is back, yet how does their armada seem to be today presently? It's consistently prudent for any carrier to have a balanced armada of airplane, so they can appropriately contend in the ever-advancing flying business sector. As far as this South African aviation routes is harshly lacking, they have 6 Airbus A322s, a single Airbus A3330, an Airbus A3430. What's more, a Boeing 737-300, which they rented. This armada can't as expected contend on the world stage, and South African aviation routes would require further speculation to grow their armada. In any case, they risk settling as a provincial carrier. Be that as it may, they could be absolved due to the conditions encompassing their endurance, despite the fact that South African aviation routes is some way behind the world's driving carriers. It really has a portion of the best possible on the African mainland. What's more, it's nothing unexpected. Why truly, when we check out at the other African carriers, you see the African aeronautics market has seen strong development in years prior and presently after a pandemic which obliterated nearly all interest for air travel. This strong development has seen an expanded venture into both private and public carriers. Today, a large group of nations across Africa are home to a portion of the world's most active aircraft's air Celis, the public transporter. The opposition of the Republic of Celis has 7 airplanes in its armada, including 6 of the seldom-spotted Viking Air DHC 6400 Rwanda, and initiated tasks as the public transporter of Rwanda in 2003, and over the course of the following 20 years, they expanded their armada size to 13, including 3 Airbus planes, 6 Boeing jets with the 737-800 BCF utilized as freight armada, 2 Bombardier planes and 2 De Valon, 8,400. They're viewed by a larger number of people as one of the best aircrafts on the landmass. Close Egypt is one of a handful of the carriers more seasoned than the politically sanctioned racial segregation rendition of South African aviation routes. So it's nothing unexpected that they have one of the biggest armadas of business airplane on the planet. There's 72 airplanes, including 28 Boeing 737-800s, puts them in front of each and every nation on the African landmass, with the exception of the pick of the bundle EOP Econ carriers, is by a long shot the biggest aircraft in Africa. As a matter of fact, they are the world's 4th biggest carrier. By number of nations, serve very much like South Africa. They are very decisively situated at the Horn of Africa, which interfaces focal and Southeast Asia to the Center East. Obviously, they likewise have the greatest armada, with their 140 airplanes being higher than the following 2 greatest African aircrafts joined. So while South African aviation routes isn't exactly prepared to rival Africa's enormous 2, it does have a generally excellent potential for success against the carriers from the remainder of the landmass. What's more, in the event that they get every one of their undertakings in request, they could undoubtedly be a main 3 aircraft in Africa inside the following 10 years. Or on the other hand, not really good or bad. There may be a couple of things still awkward for South African aviation routes, yet you can't reject that. With their set of experiences and the public pride that stems from their prosperity, they would be able attempt to overcome every one of the chances and arise as a top carrier on the planet, and they may prevail in this. If we could check out the area alone, the area of South Africa is exceptionally key in world exchange. Furthermore, they're one of the nations who hope to see a blast in the interest for air travel throughout the next few decades. So not too far off, the South African aeronautics market could turn out to be truly productive. And the carriers that position themselves all right can exploit this. This regularly ought not be a worry to South African aviation routes, as they could be rescued by the South African government. Anyway, this includes some significant downfalls. You see, South African aviation routes are consuming huge amount of cash. The steady bailouts have been removed from the citizens' pocket, a negligible part of which couldn't bear to fly consistently. If they're to succeed, both mainland and intercontinentally, they would have to view way as beneficial. So they can get high-quality speculation, which would further lift their picture for the present. Some steps have been taken, justified course for South African aviation routes, such as their long-standing customer program and endeavors to rent more airplanes and venture into additional business sectors. However, assuming they are to succeed, this time they would need to guarantee that specialists can never again be in degenerate practices, and on second thought be zeroed in exclusively on development. Yet what do you think, should the South African government continue to bail their aircraft out till it becomes productive, or ought to they just let the market normally conclude? Let us in the remarks underneath.